Welcome to the Governance Podcast at the Centre for the Study of Governance and Society at King's College London. My name is Billy Christmas and I'm a lecturer in political theory here at King's. Joining me today is my colleague Dr. David Thunder, a researcher and lecturer in political and social philosophy at the Institute for Culture and Society at the University of Navarra in Spain. He is currently preparing two book manuscripts, tentatively titled May I Love My Country, In Search of a Defensible Patriotism, and Sovereign Rule and the Stillbirth of Freedom, a preface to Confederal Republicanism. Welcome, David.
Thank you very much, Billy.
So yesterday you gave a talk here at the Centre, and an important element of that talk was a certain critique of something you call sovereigntism, or the sovereign imagination, the sovereign imaginary. And the title of that talk was Political Order After the Sovereign State. So what is it that you take to be sovereigntism, and why is it that you're so critical of it?
Sovereigntism, for me, is something that is so natural now to contemporary political philosophy that it's almost like the air we breathe. We hardly notice it because it's implicit in a lot of discussions of the state and of political order. But in fact, it's a development of the modern era, and it's the idea of sovereignty as general all-purpose authority that is monopolized by a political actor within a territory. That idea as the supreme authority, as an unrivaled authority, is in fact a modern invention and arose from the efforts of absolutist monarchs to assert their authority in a very complex social landscape in which you had a feudal system with many overlapping and multiple authorities. So it was in their interests to develop a doctrine of sovereignty which basically gave them supreme authority in a territory.
So it's something that's a theoretical and kind of ideological development of the early, starting in the early modern period. So, is your criticism of it primarily in terms of as a theory of political organisation, as a kind of approach to justice, to normative political theory, or is it a critique of empirical reality? Is it that you think that this is the system we do in fact have, and it's bad for a number of reasons?
Yeah. Well, my ultimate concern is a practical concern. My ultimate concern is with how political ideology translates into political institutions and political practices. So my concern is a pragmatic, practical concern about the quality of life of ordinary citizens. And there is a paradox at the heart of my argument, namely that the doctrine of sovereignty can never be fully realized in a political institution because of social complexity. They can never really master social complexity and social dynamics to the extent that they actually exercise that monopoly over social order or social regulation. However, the effort to realize that ideal, the attempt, much like many ideologies, the effort to realize an ideal that is unrealizable can have negative consequences for the lives of people and communities. And so it's the fact that sovereignty acts as a regulative ideal for state action that is my issue, because I think it's an inappropriate and counterproductive regulative ideal that ends up damaging the social order of small-scale communities in particular and medium-scale communities, because they find that their internal, what I call their normative orders, end up being colonized by that of the state, the sovereign state.
Could you say a bit more about how it is that you think this kind of aspiration to sovereignty is so harmful to these kinds of associations?
Sure. Basically, the aspiration to exercise general purpose and supreme regulatory authority within a region, what it ends up doing is giving presumptive supremacy to the customs, the culture, the idea of justice, and the idea of social order that is embraced by state institutions. And so because they have a presumptive supremacy over rival social orders, when they come into conflict with those social orders, and when that sovereigntist doctrine is armed to the teeth, armed both with bureaucratic administrative institutions and also with fiscal powers and financial powers, it has a competitive advantage when it comes into contact with rival normative orders. And so it tends to, it may not destroy those normative orders, it may tolerate certain aspects of them, but the general trend would be towards gradual colonization, that is to say, remaking them in its own image and likeness. And one of the points I made in the talk yesterday was that because the state is a single institution, or let's just say a cluster of institutions, of relatively centralized institutions, the rules that it makes are necessarily general or universal. And so they cannot adapt themselves to the special conditions of associations, each of which has its own requirements for order.
So what do you think is worth protecting about associational life? Or what would you say to someone who wants to take the kind of opposite approach and says, well, these kind of small associations, they're undermining the authority of the national government, and that undermines our sense of national identity. It undermines kind of a more kind of cosmopolitan and open-ended form of human cooperation. And really, these are just kind of old-fashioned things which we can now do away with. Now we have nation-states. And we can all interact on kind of equal terms under the protection of the national government. What do you think is worth protecting about associational, kind of maybe perhaps small-scale and diverse life like that?
Yeah. The first thing to say is that associational life is not in and of itself necessarily always a good thing, because you can have good and bad associations, you can have harmful or noxious associations, you can have more or less just and more or less oppressive associations. So it's not an uncritical celebration of local associational life. Rather, it's to say that the kinds of creatures we are as human beings, we require socialization within face-to-face communities in order to develop our capacities as human beings, in order to enjoy worthwhile goods such as friendship, the pursuit of the truth, the pursuit of knowledge, the transmission of knowledge to future generations, and indeed handing down of traditions that can contain within them valuable way of life. This is a McIntyrean sort of point that scale matters, and that if you don't have face-to-face communities, it will be very difficult to hand on, let's say, a rich way of life within the context of more impersonal institutions, which treat us simply as individual members of a state, for example. We may be able to gain certain kinds of material welfare, even although I would say in the long term that's questionable whether that's sustainable. But let's just say, assuming that the state did provide that material welfare, other types of well-being that have to do with meaningful common goods, deliberation, and the pursuit of these common goods, whether they be friendship or excellence in some profession or in some craft. These sorts of goods cannot be promoted by large-scale bureaucratic institutions.
Okay, so you start out with this kind of tentative defense of associational life, that while just any old kind of form of associational life is not always and everywhere good, it is a necessary condition that we are able to form and live in associations. And that the sovereign state, or the kind of aspirationally sovereign state, is parasitical or kind of cannibalistic upon that. So if the goal of associational life is this kind of common flourishing, you said goods such as friendship and knowledge, generational solidarity and things like that, is there a need for external regulation of associational life in order to not guarantee but certainly regulate and give some kind of predictability that associational life will not go to the worst possible case scenario that it could, and become incredibly oppressive or something like that?
Absolutely. I believe that the ideal that I'm developing in my book is actually what I call consociational republicanism, and that ideal assumes It argues for, what I argue for is a polycentric social order. And that means essentially that different social groups have responsibility for regulating different aspects of social order. But those regulatory regimes are very often overlapping. They may not be always overlapping because some regulations may actually apply in a very, very localized domain, and there may be very little overlap with other regimes. But characteristic of an interdependent and, I would say to some extent, globalized society, we move in different social circles. We participate in a wide range of different associations. So associational orders, regulatory orders, end up overlapping in interesting ways. And this provides a certain kind of check upon associational tyranny. There are two types of checks that occur to me right now. One type of check upon associational tyranny would be where the same social domain is simultaneously regulated by more than one regime. So, for example, in a federal polity, you can have municipal governance, regional governance, and federal governance happening within the same territory, right? So then they have to jostle it out in their respective courts. And no one of them can simply have a total monopoly over that territory. And the other check on associational tyranny is a right of exit or a right of mobility. And basically that means that if you live within a geographic territory in which you don't like the way your life is being regulated, you can move to a neighboring territory or let's say a neighboring canton or a neighboring municipality. Where, for example, you prefer the tax regime there than where you have now. In the context of the sovereign state, or the aspirationally sovereign state, to the extent that it exercises a fiscal monopoly over an extended territory, just as one example of the forms of, let's say, unfreedom that you can find in a sovereign territory, it's very difficult to escape its fiscal edicts or its fiscal imperatives. So if it decides to set the tax rate through its parliament at 40% or 50%, there's very little that the citizen can do about that because there isn't a competitive environment.
Yes. So it sounds like you do want there to be political institutions to provide that kind of regulatory framework for associational life.
Absolutely.
But it's important that it be fragmented, perhaps in a federal way. So. Yeah. I suppose, do you see federal systems such as Switzerland, the United States, Germany, I suppose also India, Nigeria? Is that a viable model for what you would call a kind of a polycentric polity?
Well, they definitely embody elements of the polycentric polity, and each of those examples you give perhaps embodies to different degrees the kinds of features that I would want in a polycentric polity. The United States is an interesting case because there are quite strong, let's say, sovereigntist imperatives at work in the federal government of the United States in terms of public finance, commercial regulation, and so forth. And even in terms of constitutional jurisprudence and regulation. So nonetheless, the states do have quite strong prerogatives, the individual states. The difficulty here is to what extent, and that's something you need to look at on a case-by-case basis, to what extent that polycentricity actually trickles down to the level of the municipality, the township. And I think there is a tradition of self-government in many of the townships of the United States, as I've been told. But to what extent they have genuine fiscal autonomy is another question. I think the individual states have quite a bit of fiscal authority that may be in some cases overbearing with respect to the fiscal authority of municipalities, for example. But this is an empirical question. If I were to ask which country comes closest to the ideal that I am aspiring to, that I would like us to aspire to, I would say Switzerland probably comes closest. And one of the reasons for that is because fiscal authority is in the hands of the local cantons. And let's just say it is distributed because the federal, regional levels also exercise fiscal authority, but the fiscal power is, the majority of fiscal power remains in the hands of the cantons. And also, they have a lot of control over local regulation and local, let's say, lawmaking. Municipal regulations are very important in the cantons, and it is a highly democratic society in that sense.
Okay. So you mentioned that fiscal authority is particularly important. Could you say why you think fiscal authority in particular has this importance?
Yeah. For me, fiscal authority has special importance because as embodied beings who realize their aspirations through material resources, which could be as basic as a house, a home. We cannot develop our ideals of human flourishing without channeling material resources, utilizing material resources in order to implement our ideals. And the problem is that when governments, let's say, exercise a monopoly over a large portion of our material resources, then they do not have an incentive to control their spending habits, and they can basically waste a lot of public resources and simultaneously drain associations of potential resources they could use to implement their projects. And so I believe that the tax rate in the Western world is far above what it needs to be in order to sustain our well-being. Certain public aspects of well-being, certain aspects that only political governments can handle.
So public goods, that sort of thing.
Certain kinds of public goods, non-excludable goods, such as, I guess, road infrastructure, water system, and security. Well, they're partially non-excludable. It depends on this, especially in urban areas. Yeah.
So the emphasis on kind of localized fiscal authority is not necessarily a kind of a claim about entitlement to wealth or anything like that. It's not a kind of a libertarian claim. It's more kind of based on an empirical worry that less localized, more centralized and distant authorities, when they have fiscal power, are able to squander that money or to engage in kind of clientelism, or the kind of forms of redistribution which no one is really in favour of. Whereas at the local level, when the people, say the citizenry, observe corruption or clientelism or just spending on things that they don't really value, they were able to quite quickly exercise some kind of voice in the matter, whereas it's much harder at the national level. Is that fair to say?
Basically, I think accountability at the local level for tax spending and is one of the major issues that the governments should be answerable to the citizenry for the way they spend public money, which in fact is the money of taxpayers, the money of citizens.
Yeah.
And I think in a highly centralized tax regime, it's actually very difficult to exercise that kind of accountability, because all of the spending is very complex and it's pooled together, and so it's very difficult to sort of piece it apart and to understand exactly what the tax priorities are. And also at a practical level, it's very difficult for local citizens to exercise any meaningful influence over national politics.
Yeah. So they have kind of they may have less knowledge about what's going on at the central level, and also less of an incentive because their power is diluted.
Yes.
Because their vote is against everyone else in the country.
They have a lot less leverage. I mean, in fact, potentially an entire region or an entire, let's say, political unit of the country or territory, such as municipality, could be overwhelmed by the sheer demographics and could be outvoted by the rest of the country. So you could potentially have a taxation policy that destroys a local industry, but is approved by the majority of a country. And this is one of the... in fact, if I could mention Brexit in this context, it's just interesting to me to see how the priorities of different parts of the United Kingdom are so different. and how their interests can diverge. And perhaps in the case of Brexit, it may not have been practical to break down authorities locally, but it does make one wonder whether there are other issues of domestic policy upon which there could be divergence, and there could be advantages to local adaptation. In other words, different localities having different policy priorities and techniques and so on.
So the extent to which the polity is decentralized sounds, and as opposed to being sovereign and being polycentric, it sounds like this is definitely a matter of degree, right? It's not like there are states that are sovereign, there are states that are polycentric. It's always going to be a matter of degree.
It's always a matter of degree, and the reality is that in practice, a certain amount of fragmentation is probably inevitable in a large-scale polity. I mean, in the sense that it's going to have different administrative units. But you could even say, even in France, like a highly centralized country like France, the administrative units will have certain prerogatives, certain amount of autonomy, but ultimately they serve at the pleasure of the sovereign state, and the state can regulate and alter their jurisdictions at will, pretty much. It may be bound by certain constitutional, constitutional rules, but they are the rules of the state as such. I think the test of whether a system is truly polycentric, or let's just say a kind of paradigmatic case of a highly polycentric system, would be a system in which units of the system have a right of secession. Because if there is a right of secession, that demonstrates that they have a high level of autonomy.
So, in a sense, you can't really tell how polycentric a system is based on the extent to which it's decentralized, because every system depends upon there being tiers of power. The question really is, which direction does the kind of authorization go in? Do the localized units get their legal authority, I say, from above, or do they get it from below and then pass that authority upwards towards the top?
Yes, and I think another way of thinking about it is, how are disagreements between the units settled? How are they habitually settled? If the top level tends to win out in those disagreements and tends to impose its own imperatives, its own preferences, then that is a sure sign that it's not a genuinely polycentric system, that the system is formally maybe have multiple centers, but the centers are in fact being controlled from the top.
Yes.
So it's about control. Polycentrism is not just the idea that there are multiple administrative units. It's about where control of public administration actually lies. And if it's at the center, if it's at one center or a few centers, that's a monocentric system or tends towards monocentrism. If the controls are at the periphery, then that would be a genuinely polycentric system.
You want to see these units kind of in competition with each other, or certainly engaging in some kind of bargaining or negotiation with one another, and you think that would be kind of a healthy symptom of the system.
Yes.
Rather than simply appealing to upward authority to settle matters.
Yes, and I would even say that, ironically, a sovereigntist political system can actually be so inflexible that it can accelerate social conflict, because it's a bit like a stick that doesn't bend. I mean, either it breaks or it stays straight. There's only two options. And it's something like that you could say is the sovereigntist system, because because of the habit of sovereigntist thinking and the doctrine of sovereigntism, which is often constitutionalized, central governments have a strong incentive to insist upon the supremacy of their normative order and their decisions. And when they come into collision with local dissenters, they don't have resources to bargain adequately with those local dissenters, because they feel compelled to assert their sovereigntist prerogatives. And an example of this is Catalonia in Spain, because the outcome of that, it is fundamentally a political and cultural conflict. But because the Spanish Constitution attributes sovereignty to the Spanish state and considers the autonomous regions of Spain as emanations of the sovereign state. The conflict with Catalonia actually resulted in Spanish government sending in troops, sending in military backup, so to speak, national police, in order to prevent certain kinds of illegal votes in Catalonia. But it came to a kind of a standoff between the Catalan government and the Spanish government, partly because there is no way to renegotiate the constitutional framework of Spain without renouncing the principle of sovereignty. And that is a fundamental commitment of the constitutional arrangement.
Yeah.
What I'm advocating is constitutional schemes in which renegotiation of jurisdiction is something that doesn't destroy the Constitution.
So it's always on the table.
It's always on the table. There's always a possibility of renegotiation.
So your kind of image of how constitutions ought to be is that they should be sort of open-ended in a way, and always potentially open to renegotiation and revision from sources of authority which the Constitution may not recognise at any given time. It should be open to recognising new sources of authority.
Yes.
I suppose the question that perhaps a constitutional theorist within the mindset of the sovereigntist imagination might say is, well, that sounds perfectly nice, but who maintains the open-endedness of the Constitution? Who ensures that it is always open to new sources of legal authority?
Yes. Well, I believe that the basic constitution of a polity, of a federal polity, would be political in character, in the sense that it's both its reach and its legitimation would have a territorial character. That's just something I want to clarify. And fundamental renegotiations of a constitutional charter or a constitution, I believe, would give a privileged position to political governments, that constitute the polity, and ideally, those negotiations would have to be multilateral or bilateral, as the case may be. In other words, the interested parties would have to agree to come to the table and renegotiate the terms. I simply don't believe that it's necessary to have a single supreme actor who oversees negotiations. 2 or 3 or more negotiating parties are perfectly capable of nominating a third party to adjudicate or to, let's just say, facilitate and mediate negotiations. They don't need an all-powerful sort of overarching party that can intervene at any moment with power in order to carry out constructive negotiations.
Yeah.
And the world of markets and business, we get these kinds of negotiations all the time of contracts and renegotiations of contracts. But for some reason, we have a hard time thinking that this could be a viable model for political negotiation. Sometimes some people have difficulty with that.
Yes. Yeah. So it's a good example of a form of kind of, I guess, polycentric authority or kind of open-ended authority is private arbitration, which is a very, very common practice. But do you not think it would be fair to say that the reason that is effective, that where two parties bilaterally nominate a third party to enforce their negotiation, the reason that is effective is because it takes place against the kind of the backdrop of an already kind of, in a sense, monopolized legal order that says, by the way, if you sign contracts where you nominate third parties and then you renege after that, we will then come after you. We will enforce your agreement with that third party.
I don't think that the integrity of contracts necessarily relies upon a single enforcer sovereign enforcer who can adjudicate contractual disputes. In the international arena, for example, contracts are negotiated all the time between businesses, and those contracts, the businesses, basically that's against the backdrop of multiple national governments that could be implicated by those contracts. And no one of those national governments necessarily has exclusive jurisdiction over those disputes. As far as I'm aware, companies can choose the jurisdiction under which their dispute will be adjudicated or arbitrated if necessary. But I think just to get away from the premise that we need this overarching enforcer for contracts to be valid, we definitely do need there to be penalties for non-compliance with contracts. I think that's very important. But one of those penalties can be a loss of reputation, a loss of credibility. So if you renege on your contracts, you will get a very bad reputation over time. So there are reputational costs to being a bad player and to acting unfairly that shouldn't be overlooked. And also you may be able to mutually nominate third-party enforcers and choose certain penalties. But in that situation, you don't have a single sort of automatic enforcer within a territory necessarily. I mean, in practice, of course, in a federal polity, you're going to have disputes from time to time over whether the local, the regional, or the federal government has jurisdiction to enforce a contract. But that's what laws are for, and that's what lawyers are for, right? For trying to work out the details of that.
I'm going to push back against this one more time, and then we'll move on to a different subject, because I particularly find this part of it very interesting, because this is an issue I try to grapple with. So the reputational cost of reneging on contracts is certainly real, and definitely has definitely induces compliance in a lot of scenarios. But typically, I think we should expect the disciplinary power of repeated dealings and reputational effects to occur with things like business people or kind of economic actors, entrepreneurs that have an interest in securing long-term cooperation with predictable to yield predictable income flows. But what about when people, and that certainly explains how international business kind of operates without it being very obvious that there's a single jurisdiction overarching them. But what about when you're not getting into it for a long-term income stream? You're not interested in making money. You're interested in committing genocide, say, and you take power in a region, and you want to exterminate a tribe of people, an ethnic group or something. And maybe you've signed up to some UN charter to say that you won't do that, but who cares? I'm just going to renege on that agreement, and no one's going to enforce it, and I don't really care about my reputation. What I care about is exterminating this tribe. What about those kind of situations when people are not being, I know you're probably not going to like this phrase, but not being rational economic actors, but are being, power hungry, and aspire to be in a position of kind of unchecked political power?
Yeah. I mean, I guess the first point to make is that having a centralized political apparatus in which power is concentrated at the center is actually an invitation for power-hungry people to try to get leverage over the entire society. So a federal structure is actually a check on power-hungry individuals who want to monopolize public power and public authority. The second point to make is that the regulation of civil life and such as contracts and let's say local disputes that are within the bounds of civility, you might say, to do with property rights and so on, is quite a different matter than the regulation of outright violence and crime and criminality. And basically, I totally accept that we need military. We need an army, generally speaking. We need a police force. We need a security system, and that security system can be to some extent decentralized, because I think local areas can have their own security systems. But when you're dealing with, it really depends on the level of the threat as to what degree of centralized security you need. So, for example, a standing army, which interestingly was one of the big debates about the founding of the United States, was whether we should have a standing army or not, and whether this was some threat to liberty to have a standing army, as opposed to local sort of militias. Well, having a standing army in a modern context probably makes sense, and also having robust police forces and quite sophisticated intelligence services. But I think that one of the fallacies of the argument for the sovereign state is to assume that because certain aspects of security need to be centralized, therefore every aspect of public regulation needs to be centralized. So I want to make a break between those two moves and say, yes, I concede that certain aspects of both external and internal security would logically need to be centralized. Not all, but some. But it wouldn't follow from that, in my view, that every aspect of regulation inevitably must be centralized. The important thing is that the use of security forces remains, that there are local checks on that, and that the central government, in fact, is being controlled from the periphery, and that the periphery has the power to remove its allegiance to that central government.
Okay, thank you. So I want to move on to just a kind of two other strands of this work before we finish. So when we talk about polycentric governance, and you mentioned that it's very important to localize, particularly fiscal control, an argument for that is often that when you kind of shrink down the size of jurisdictions, or kind of geographical legal monopolies, or not quite monopolies, what you do is you make exit less costly. So if I don't like some new policy that Parliament puts in place, I can move to a country in the EU, or I can move somewhere else, and that's just incredibly costly, and I'm not going to do it. Whereas if I really just don't like the tax code or something, or the speech codes or something of Hackney, I can just move to Islington, and that's actually something that you could do. That's actually a reasonable thing to do. But an important part of your work previous to these books has been on citizenship and something like democratic participation, which emphasizes, rather than the ability to kind of vote with your feet and just leave situations that you don't like, it emphasizes the importance, the ethical importance perhaps, of participation. So could you perhaps say something about your work on citizenship and how you see it as speaking to your current work on the critique of the sovereign state?
Yes. My book on citizenship, which is called Citizenship and the Pursuit of the Worthy Life, which was in 2014, that book is quite a conservative book. What it does is it assumes the structure of constitutional democracy in the Western world. It assumes a relatively centralized democratic constitution, and it asks the question: can citizens live a worthy life within that kind of context, political context? What would it take for a citizen to govern their life responsibly and to develop the full panoply of human virtues within that political context? And my conclusion is that it would be difficult but not impossible, given those kinds of political structures. Citizens can, with a lot of effort and struggle, can overcome certain obstacles to flourishing and self-government. But I did come to the conclusion that it was too conservative as a project from my perspective, and that what it led me to was to question whether that institutional context is an appropriate one or a fitting one for self-government. and for indeed living a flourishing life and acquiring the goods that can only be provided by local communities. So that led me to rethinking of the institutional scheme, and that's what led me to my current book, in which I'm developing an alternative model of constitutionalism and of democracy, which is, as we have just said, is polycentric. And I would say that right now, where my thinking stands on this is that self-government and participation in public institutions takes two forms, if you will. One is strictly political form, in which I'm trying to influence public policy of political governments, territorial political governments. And the other is associational participation, in which I'm trying to influence the shape and policies of a non-political association. And for me, that form of participation is an exercise in self-government as well, and often one that is, by some democratic theorists, is not sufficiently emphasized.
Okay. So that segues quite nicely onto the next question. You referred to your view, you see it as a form of republicanism, namely consociational republicanism. So in my background in contemporary political philosophy, republicanism refers usually to neo-Roman republicanism, which sees the most important goal of the polity as a form of liberty, as non-domination, which typically I take to be very critical and suspicious of group life, of associational life, and sees the republic, a republican state, as something which liberates you from these kind of parochial forms of domination. So how do you see your own republicanism, consociational republicanism, in contrast to neo-Roman republicanism of someone like Pettit?
Yes. I've read some of Pettit's work on republicanism, and I think there's a lot of value to the idea of non-domination, the absence of arbitrary interference by a third party, including the state, is a useful way to think about freedom, but it's also an incomplete way to think about freedom, because freedom is only meaningful, is only valuable to the extent that it is used to achieve human goods, to flourish, to develop our capacities to enjoy life. So freedom is not an empty ideal for me. It is oriented towards some form of flourishing. And so the mere absence of domination, for me, is not sufficient in and of itself to redeem the value of freedom. The form of republicanism that I would endorse isn't exactly neo-Roman republicanism. It's probably more what we might call civic republicanism, or classical republicanism, or neo-Aristotelian republicanism, if you will.
Greek, not Roman.
So more Greek than Roman, although it's probably artificial to separate them completely because there's a lot of overlap. When I read Cicero, I really do see a lot of marks of classical republicanism, civic republicanism, seeking the good, the common good of the polity, and so on. That form of republicanism emphasizes the need to develop a certain kinds of virtues and attitudes and public spiritedness, but also as an intrinsic value, as intrinsically valuable qualities, and as elements of a well-lived human life. That kind of republicanism extols the value of self-government as something that is, in fact, enhances the value of a human life, and is not merely instrumental. Where I differ from classical Republican and civic Republican tradition, and I think it's a significant difference, is that I consider political institutions to be only one element, one vehicle of self-government, and not necessarily the most important vehicle of self-government. For me, associations, non-political associations, in many instances are actually a more important vehicle of self-government than political associations. They invite more participation. They provide more channels of participation and of rational dominion in the social sphere than political institutions. Political institutions provide a framework for the self-government that occurs in associations. But realistically, I'm fully aware that political institutions are only consistent with a limited level of participation, even in a local level. So if we're only relying on political institutions for self-government, we'd be in very bad shape.
Okay. So Iris Marion Young has had a criticism of republicanism and Republican philosophy more broadly, which was something along the lines of the public spiritedness of a participant in the Republic was a very homogenizing concept, and what she saw is that it was very kind of masculine and white and Eurocentric concept, which kind of de facto excluded all these forms of difference, as she puts it. It excludes women, it excludes different ethnic groups. Do you think that homogenizing tendency of Republican theory is part of what you see as the danger and the kind of cannibalism of the sovereign state upon associational life, or is what Iris Marion Young would call it kind of different groups?
Yes, I do. I think that if we concentrate the ideal of self-government upon political agency or agency within the context of political structures, that there is a danger that we will homogenize the ideal of self-government by attaching it to the activities that occur in the context of those particular kinds of institutions, and that we will deprecate or underestimate the value of, let's say, non-political associational action. I would say that it's not uniquely a problem for the sovereign state necessarily, that particular problem, because even a federalized republicanism, if it focused exclusively on the political channels of self-government, could, let's say, obscure the value or underestimate the value of agency within non-political associations and the different forms that self-government can take. So Vincent Ostrom, when he talks about American federalism, he is quite clear that self-government must be exercised not only in political governments, it is also an ideal way of life that is instantiated in many different non-political associations.
A separate strand of your critique of the sovereign state, I'm not sure how much of the book is dedicated to it or if it's a more of a passing thought, but you mentioned it in your talk yesterday. You said that the notion of a sovereign state to protect freedom was a kind of deduction from the ontological or moral individualism of the Enlightenment. Could you say more about why you think that moral or ontological individualism is problematic, and why you think it entails the idea of sovereignty, or the need for sovereignty?
Yes. Basically, I noticed a pattern in defenders of the sovereign state, starting in the 17th century and moving forwards. And this pattern, I think, is particularly marked in Hobbes, but you see it in Locke, and you see it in Kant, and you see it in Rousseau, and you see it in John Rawls and in many contemporary political philosophers. The pattern I noticed was that when they discuss problems of civic order or political order, they treat those problems fundamentally as a kind of coordination game played by a set of individuals. So it's not that they've eliminated groups completely, because they assume a single group, the group of individuals who will form a state. The people. But the jungle of associations that actually constitutes that group, that single group that forms a state, that jungle of associations is given passing recognition in Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, and Kant, and Rawls and other theorists, it's not that they deny that individuals have groups and belong to groups. Rawls is quite clear that we have background cultures and that we belong to churches and we have different types of conceptions of the good.
Yeah.
But when it comes to setting up the problem of political order, they simply barely discuss the dynamics of intergroup coordination. And I find that astonishing. I was very surprised by it as a pattern. And I had to scratch my head and wonder why intergroup coordination was left out of the picture.
Yeah.
And the conclusion I came to was that they were in the throes of a kind of individualist image of society.
Yeah.
And that for them, the imagination that drove their projects, the social imaginary that drove their projects, was an individualist imaginary in which it's individuals who need to assert their rights in the context of a very large group.
So on your view, do you think it's fair to say if we must do kind of state of nature, social contract theorizing, the state of nature is not a homogenized and yet disorganized people. It's a set of very different forms of pre-existing social organizations, families, tribes, groups, religions, and this sort of thing.
Yes,
the
basically,
state must emerge as a result of these groups coordinating with each other rather than an entire...
That's the proper way to construe a state of nature. If you really want to set up a state of nature, problematic as that construct is going to be, you might as well build in some of the relevant empirical features that are besides the fact that they're individuals were trying to cooperate. So Hobbes, for example, recognized heads of households. And I think, as far as I'm aware, he considers those individuals to act as heads of households.
The same in Rawls, I think, which is
interestingly,
came under a feminist critique.
Yeah. And but the question is, why should we stop at the level of heads of households? Why should that be the only unit that enters into the equation when it comes to discussing coordination? Why can't we talk about cities? Why can't we talk about towns and villages? And why can't we talk about regions? Why can't we talk about churches or even just universities? Why are all of these players just completely sidelined in the way we set up the game? I mean, to me, that's arbitrary. It's an arbitrary way of sidelining them. I accept that all political philosophy must involve a certain simplification. Right, you need to treat certain phenomena as background noise. They become a form of background noise. But there's a hell of a lot of background noise going on if the only relevant actors are heads of households.
Yeah. We have just a couple of more minutes left at most, because I know you have to go and catch a plane. But you said in your talk that you take that your case for a kind of a polycentric form of governance to be a perfectionist case. Which is to say that it's grounded in the kind of the ethical good of persons. You don't describe it as a liberal case, and you don't make too much mention to the importance of kind of protecting freedom. It's more about protecting valuable forms of life. Perfectionism is not a very popular or fashionable position in contemporary political theory. Everyone kind of goes out of their way to show that their view is some form of liberalism. Do you take your perfectionism to be illiberal, or certainly at odds with a kind of liberal anti-perfectionism?
Well, I think logically my position is inconsistent with anti-perfectionist liberalism, for sure. Though interestingly, it actually shares some of the underlying concerns of anti-perfectionist liberalism, such as Isaiah Berlin's fear of a big brother state that would be telling us how to live. I think it's a misunderstanding of perfectionism to assume that it endorses a paternalistic kind of big brother state necessarily, because it's one thing to affirm that the end of social development, all around social development, should be human flourishing, and it's quite another thing to say that the state should be endorsing a particular model of flourishing. So I think that's an important clarification, because my view is that, first of all, which I didn't really clarify very well in the talk yesterday, that point didn't come across fully, that my idea of flourishing is actually a libertarian ideal of flourishing, in the sense that freedom and deliberation, the agent's own decisions and choices, have to be part of their own flourishing. In other words, their flourishing has to be shaped by their own agency, and their own, if you want, a certain form of rational mastery on the part of the agent, and that rational mastery or autonomy is actually part of their flourishing. And that's Joseph Raz's view of the morality of freedom. And I share that view, which is the reason why there are strong liberty-based arguments against certain forms of paternalist intervention, because they can damage the good of autonomy. Because for me, autonomy is part of the human good. And so, I guess, so yes, it's a perfectionist position, but it's a polycentric perfectionist position, meaning that there are many different actors that can assist an individual in attaining his or her flourishing, and no one of those actors has a kind of omnicompetent supervisory role over the process. And there are very good prudential reasons to limit the powers of the state that have to do with the fact that it can go badly wrong in its judgments about flourishing. So the idea of arming the state with a perfectionist sort of imperative to impose a particular model of flourishing upon everybody, I think, is a sovereigntist way of thinking. And I think Berlin's critique is implicitly a critique of the sovereign state. It's not a critique of political perfectionism in general.
Yes, okay. I think we better leave it there so that you can get back to Spain. So thank you very much for that, David. I know I don't speak for myself when I say that was really interesting, and that I'm really enjoying reading both of your books when they're finished and out.
Yeah, thank you very much. I've enjoyed the discussion.
And thanks everyone for listening.